My name is Brielle, and I'm 34 years old. I used to believe that love could smooth out even the sharpest corners of a relationship, that if you were patient and kind, people would eventually see your worth. That belief shattered the day my husband's family, the Whitlocks, placed me behind everyone in their perfect, polished family portrait. Nathan, my husband, was always the kind-hearted type, the kind who avoided confrontation like it was a disease. He loved his family more than he knew how to love himself. And maybe that's why he didn't notice the way they looked at me. To them, I wasn't Brielle, the woman who built her own consulting business from scratch. I was Brielle, the outsider, the woman who didn't fit their refined image of what a Whitlock should be. The Whitlocks were the kind of family that looked like they belonged on magazine covers, refined, symmetrical, and fake to the core. The matriarch, Margaret Whitlock, was as sharp as her diamonds and twice as cold. She ran the family like a boardroom, and everyone deferred to her. Her eldest, Damien, and his sister Callista, were mirror images of their mother, confident, wealthy, and ruthless in their subtle ways. I remember the annual family portrait day vividly. It was their tradition, an event treated with more reverence than Christmas. Every person had their assigned place, like an unwritten hierarchy. Damien and his wife stood near Margaret, their little ones posed in front of them. Callista, elegant as ever, positioned herself on the right, basking in flattering lighting. Nathan and I waited quietly as the photographer arranged everyone. When he looked at me and hesitated, Margaret stepped forward with that smile of hers, the kind that never reached her eyes. "Brielle, dear, could you move a little further back? We need some symmetry." "Of course," I said, forcing a polite smile. It wasn't the first time she'd said it. It wouldn't be the last. I shifted backward until I could barely see myself in the camera's preview screen. Nathan didn't say a word. He just adjusted his tie and smiled like this was normal. Like his wife fading into the background was something to accept. Click. The flash went off, freezing the moment forever me, slightly blurred, almost out of focus. Afterward, as everyone laughed and gathered around to admire the perfect family photo, I stood off to the side, feeling smaller than I had in years. I caught a glimpse of the photo on the photographer's screen, Margaret and her children at the center, radiant and strong. I was a shadow behind them. When Nathan finally turned to me and said, "You looked beautiful," I almost laughed. Beautiful wasn't the word for what I felt. Invisible was closer. Later that evening, during dinner, the Whitlocks continued their usual performance. Polite laughter, discussions about investments, vacation homes, and charities. I barely spoke. Every time I opened my mouth, Callista found a way to redirect the topic. Damien threw in condescending comments disguised as jokes. Even Margaret's compliments carried thorns. "You have such a casual style, Brielle," she said as we dined under the chandeliers. "It's refreshing. Most women overdo it." I smiled thinly. "Thank you, Margaret." Inside, I wanted to scream. When we left that night, Nathan noticed my silence in the car. "Don't take it so personally." I turned to look at him. "You didn't even notice they put me behind everyone again, did you?" He blinked. "Brielle, it's just a photo." No, it wasn't. It was a hierarchy in high definition, and I'd just been told where I stood. When we got home, I went to my office and sat in front of my desk, still wearing the same black dress I'd worn for the portrait. I stared at the framed photos on the shelf, pictures of me before marriage, confident and radiant, surrounded by my own accomplishments. Somewhere along the way, I'd traded my independence for acceptance. I poured myself a glass of wine, sat back, and thought about every moment I'd bitten my tongue, every smile I'd forced, every time I'd allowed myself to be pushed a little further into the background. My fingers tightened around the glass. No more. If they wanted to treat me like I didn't belong, fine. I wouldn't beg for their approval anymore. But I would make sure that one day, when the family gathered for another photo when they stood in perfect formation again, things would look very different. Because that night, I decided it would be the last time they made me invisible. They thought I wouldn't notice the pattern, but I did every detail of how they erased me. After that humiliating family photo, I started paying closer attention. Every glance, every gesture, every carefully chosen word around me carried intent. The Whitlocks didn't raise their voices, they wielded silence and smiles like knives. The next few weeks were filled with small, calculated exclusions. There were dinner invitations that never reached me, events forgotten until the last moment, and private family chats that Nathan was part of but somehow never mentioned to me. When I confronted him, he looked genuinely puzzled. "I thought I told you," he'd say, brows furrowed. But he hadn't. He never did. Margaret's control over her family was complete. Even her kindness was a strategy. She'd host luncheons and charity teas, surrounding herself with society women who adored her authority. When I attended, I was always greeted warmly until conversation topics shifted to legacies, pedigrees, and names. Then I became the invisible one again. At one particular luncheon, Callista smiled across the table and said, "Brielle, dear, how is your little consulting thing going?" I smiled back. "It's going well, thank you. I just signed 2 new corporate clients this quarter." Her laughter rang like glass breaking. "Corporate clients, how ambitious, that's adorable." The other women tittered politely. I felt my chest tighten, but I didn't respond. I'd learned that silence unsettled people more than defense. Later that day, I overheard something I wasn't meant to. As I passed the kitchen, I heard Margaret's voice drift through the doorway. "She's capable, I suppose. But Nathan could have done better. We need to keep her in her place." My hands froze around my purse strap. The cook's ladle clinked against the pot, masking my rapid heartbeat. In her place. I mouthed the words as I left the house, pretending I hadn't heard a thing. At home, I started keeping a notebook. It wasn't a diary, more like evidence. I wrote down everything. Every snide remark. Every undermining gesture. Every public humiliation disguised as civility. I gave it a name. The Ledger. It started as a coping mechanism but soon became something sharper. I wasn't just documenting pain, I was mapping patterns. Patterns of control, power, influence. I noticed who obeyed Margaret without question. Who feared her. Who whispered in corners. It was around this time that I started noticing whispers about Margaret's will. The family attorney, an older man named Mr. Grayson, came to the estate frequently. Each time he left, conversations fell to hushes. I once heard Callista say, "Mother's finally reworking the inheritance. About time she cleans up the old arrangement." Inheritance, legacy, money. That was their real religion. I'd never cared much for wealth. I had my own career, my independence, but something about the way they worshipped power made me curious. How much control did Margaret truly have? And what would happen if that control were redirected? One afternoon, I stayed behind after a family brunch. Margaret had asked me to help organize the dining room, something about getting a sense of my taste. As I tidied the table, I noticed an open folder at the edge of her writing desk. The word estate was typed neatly at the top. Beneath it, I glimpsed notes in Mr. Grayson's handwriting. Review trust adjustments. Confirm successor executor. Successor executor. Someone would eventually take Margaret's place overseeing the family's financial affairs. That someone wasn't going to be me, not yet, but the thought lingered. If I couldn't sit at their table, maybe I could own the table itself. That night, I asked Nathan casually, "Do you know if your mother's updating her will?" He looked surprised. "I think so." "Why?" "I just overheard her talking with Mr. Grayson." "Oh," he shrugged. "Probably the usual. Damien will get the business, Callista the art collection, and I'll get whatever's left." His tone was casual, but something in me hardened. Whatever's left. That was Nathan's entire approach to life, except what's left over. And because of that, I was living in the shadow of leftovers too. The next morning, I woke up early, made coffee, and opened my notebook. I drew a line down the center of a blank page. On one side, I wrote, "How they control." On the other, "How I can use it." Under the first column, I listed, "Social hierarchy, manipulation through tradition." financial dependency, public perception. Under the second, I started brainstorming quietly. Ways to become necessary, useful, respected, feared, even. If their power was built on appearances and money, then I would speak their language but better. It was the beginning of something I couldn't yet name, a slow, deliberate unspooling of patience that would one day become vengeance. I started reading about trusts and inheritance law during my lunch breaks. At first, it was just curiosity. Then it became obsession. Every rule, every clause, every loophole felt like a puzzle piece I could fit into my growing plan. Nathan thought I was overcompensating for his family's treatment. Maybe he was right. But deep down, something inside me had shifted. I didn't want their approval anymore. I wanted to dismantle the foundation they stood on, the one that made them think they could look down on me. The Whitlocks prided themselves on control. But control can be transferred. It can be signed away with a pen, notarized, and filed quietly in an office drawer. And when that realization hit me, it lit a spark I couldn't extinguish. That's when I realized the Whitlocks only valued power, and I could use that against them. Money was the only language the Whitlocks truly understood. Once I realized that, everything about them began to make sense. The way Margaret demanded control over every transaction, the way Damien measured people by the value of their assets, and the way Callista's affection always coincided with someone's net worth. It wasn't love that tied the Whitlocks together, it was wealth. And if I wanted to level the field, I had to learn their language fluently. I began by quietly studying. During the day, I managed my consulting clients. At night, I immersed myself in articles about estate planning, inheritance law, and asset distribution. I ordered books, downloaded legal templates, and even watched lectures online. What began as casual curiosity became a secret education. The Whitlocks had no idea how much I was learning. They thought I was keeping myself busy while waiting for Nathan to grow into the family's business circle. In reality, I was tracing the veins of their empire, every company, every account, every name mentioned at dinner. It was during one of those dinners that I got my first real lead. Margaret mentioned she'd soon be finalizing some estate revisions before tax season. Callista smiled, eyes gleaming. I hope Mother finally fixes the trust. Damien and I have been patient long enough. Margaret said nothing. She simply sipped her wine. Nathan changed the subject, trying to diffuse the tension. But I filed that phrase, "fix the trust," into my mental ledger. Later that week, I decided to take a calculated risk. I asked Nathan about the family attorney, Mr. Grayson. He's been working with your mother forever, hasn't he? I asked casually over coffee. Yeah, Nathan said, flipping through his phone. He's practically family. Why? I was just thinking. I stirred my drink. I could use some legal advice for my business contracts. Maybe I could reach out to him. Nathan didn't think twice. Sure, I'll text him. He's a good guy. That was all I needed. When I met Mr. Grayson a few days later, it was under the guise of discussing business structure and liability protection for my consulting firm. He was professional and cordial, with that old-fashioned politeness lawyers cultivate over decades. As we talked, I dropped small, seemingly harmless questions. I imagine you've seen all kinds of families argue over inheritance, I said lightly. He chuckled. You'd be surprised, Mrs. Whitlock. Money can make even the kindest people vicious. I believe it, I replied. Nathan's family, they're very traditional about legacy. His mother seems to take it seriously. His expression softened. Mrs. Whitlock is a sharp woman. She's ensuring her affairs are in order before she slows down. A wise move, frankly. I smiled. She's lucky to have you. He nodded, then mentioned something that made my pulse quicken. We've been reviewing her trust for a while now, nothing drastic. But she wants to make sure everything reflects her wishes precisely. Precisely. That word hung in the air. I didn't press further. I thanked him for his help, got his card, and left feeling like I'd opened a door I wasn't supposed to know existed. That night, I spread my notes across the dining table. There were flowcharts, asset diagrams, and handwritten connections between each Whitlock sibling. Damien and Callista were the favored heirs. Nathan's share was a gesture, not a legacy. But as I studied, I noticed something odd. A missing piece. Margaret's late son, Andrew, had passed away years ago, leaving behind a daughter, April. Sweet, quiet April, barely in her 20s, often ignored like I was. She was polite, reserved, and treated as though she barely existed in the family narrative. I remembered how Margaret always avoided mentioning her when talking about heirs. If April's father's share hadn't been properly restructured after his death, it might still be sitting dormant, untouched but legally viable. That was when the idea took root. I didn't want to steal anything. I just wanted to tilt the balance to remind them that the world didn't revolve around their self-importance. But as I stared at my growing web of notes, my intentions started to blur. It wasn't just about respect anymore. It was about control. I started volunteering more around the estate, helping with planning, coordination, anything that gave me proximity to documents and conversations. I became the reliable daughter-in-law who asked all the right questions, offered all the right help, and never made trouble. Margaret began to notice. "Brielle, you're so organized," she said one afternoon as I helped her sort through correspondence. "You'd make an excellent assistant." I smiled. "Just trying to be useful." "Oh, you are, dear," she said, scribbling something in her notebook. "It's refreshing to see someone so interested in how things work." She had no idea how deeply I was studying every move she made. The Whitlocks thought power was inherited. They didn't realize it could be learned, studied, and taken quietly, piece by piece, with a steady hand and an iron will. Every night, I'd rewrite my notes, refining my understanding of the trust. I mapped the timeline of when revisions would happen, how decisions flowed through Mr. Grayson, and who stood to benefit. And somewhere between late-night research sessions and quiet dinners, my anger hardened into focus. I wasn't just keeping score anymore. I didn't just plan revenge, I drafted it like a contract. If they wouldn't give me a seat at the table, I'd build the table myself. The Whitlocks' annual charity gala was the crown jewel of their social calendar, a night of glittering gowns, expensive smiles, and self-congratulation. Margaret hosted it every spring at the family estate, and it served one purpose: to remind the community that the Whitlocks weren't just wealthy, they were essential. So when Margaret mentioned during brunch that the event planner had suddenly fallen ill, I saw my opening. "Oh dear," she sighed, pressing her napkin to her lips. "I suppose we'll have to postpone unless someone steps in." "I could help," I said before anyone else could speak. The table went quiet. Callista's fork clinked against her plate. "You?" she asked with a polite smile. "Oh, Brielle, it's a huge task. Mother's events are quite elaborate." "I know," I replied smoothly. "I've managed corporate launches with over 500 guests. I'm sure I can handle a dinner and a few sponsors." Margaret studied me for a moment, weighing the risk. Finally, she nodded. "Very well. You'll work with my assistant and Mr. Grayson on approvals. Let's see what you can do." That was all the permission I needed. Over the next month, I threw myself into the planning. Every call, every vendor, every detail ran through me. I kept immaculate spreadsheets, managed communication chains, and made sure Margaret's vision was executed flawlessly. But beneath the surface, I had another goal: to make myself indispensable. I made sure everyone associated my name with competence. When the caterer praised the organization, I said, "All credit to Mrs. Whitlock for trusting me." When reporters called for press details, I framed the narrative around Margaret Whitlock's legacy of leadership. Every success reflected on her and by extension on me. Callista tried to undermine me, of course. She'd show up unannounced and nitpick flower arrangements or table placements. Once, she told the decorator to change an entire color scheme behind my back. I didn't confront her. I simply called Margaret and said gently, "I wanted to confirm your preference. I'd hate to misinterpret your style." Margaret, predictably, was furious that Callista interfered. The next day, the decorator apologized and said, "Mrs. Whitlock told us to follow your direction exclusively." That was my first quiet victory. As the gala approached, the family attorney, Mr. Grayson, began appearing more often. I made sure to always have his favorite tea ready and ask subtle, intelligent questions about event compliance and donor documentation. He seemed impressed. "You're quite thorough, Mrs. Whitlock," he said one evening as we reviewed guest contracts. "Most people overlook the fine print. Details are everything," I said with a calm smile. Margaret overheard and chuckled. "Brielle pays attention to things others miss. It's her strength." Those words echoed in my head for days. She was starting to trust me not just as Nathan's wife, but as a capable woman in her own right. On the night of the gala, the estate glittered under chandeliers and garden lanterns. The guests arrived in waves of silk and perfume, and Margaret basked in the compliments. Every aspect of the evening ran seamlessly: the music, the lighting, the wine pairings. When a reporter asked Margaret how she managed such a flawless event, she gestured toward me. "My daughter-in-law handled everything. She's quite talented." The word daughter-in-law had never sounded so warm, coming from her lips. I smiled for the cameras, calm and poised, even as I felt Callista's glare from across the room. Later, while Margaret mingled, Mr. Grayson pulled me aside. "You know," he said with a kind smile, "you have a knack for this sort of thing: organization, diplomacy, presentation. Mrs. Whitlock is fortunate to have someone she can rely on." "That means a lot," I said sincerely. "I only want to make things easier for her." It wasn't a lie. I was making things easier, just not in the way anyone imagined. By the end of the evening, the gala was hailed as the most successful in Whitlock history. The charity raised record donations, and several business partners praised Margaret's forward-thinking leadership. When the last guest left, Margaret approached me, still glowing from the night's triumph. "You've done beautifully, Brielle. Truly. I couldn't have managed this without you." "Thank you," I said softly. "I'm glad it brought you pride." "It did," she said, taking my hand. "You have a sharp mind. Not many in this family do." That small moment of connection, her hand gripping mine, her acknowledgement, was everything I'd been waiting for. From that point on, Margaret began including me in private discussions. "What do you think of Damien's proposal?" she'd ask over tea. "Do you believe Callista can handle the charity accounts?" Each question was a test, and each answer an opportunity. I never criticized outright. I simply guided her gently toward conclusions that served both her pride and my plan. I didn't need to manipulate her directly. All I had to do was be the one she trusted most. As weeks passed, I noticed subtle shifts in the family dynamic. Callista grew increasingly jealous. Damien complained that I was overstepping. Nathan, sweet, oblivious Nathan, just looked proud whenever Margaret praised me. He didn't see the strategy behind my patience, because while they were busy defending their positions in the family's hierarchy, I was quietly redrawing the structure beneath them. The trust, the estate, the influence, it all flowed through Margaret, and Margaret now leaned on me. The woman they once pushed to the back row was now the one they turned to for answers. They thought I wanted their approval, but I was already rewriting their future. Every compliment they gave me hid another layer of contempt. After the gala, the Whitlocks began treating me differently, but not in the way I'd hoped. They didn't suddenly welcome me with open arms. Instead, they adjusted their smiles, sharpened their tones, and began watching me more closely. Respect in that family wasn't earned, it was tolerated, and I was starting to notice the cracks in their civility. Margaret praised me often now, especially in front of others. "Brielle has a real talent for organization," she'd say. "I don't know how we ever managed before her." Callista would smile tightly and reply, "Oh yes, Brielle's quite industrious. She really thrives when she's in charge of the small things." Small things. The way she said it made it sound like I'd been given permission to play house while the adults handled the real decisions. Damien wasn't any better. During a family lunch, he turned to me with that smug grin of his and said, Nathan laughed politely, not realizing the jab in his brother's words. "She's been amazing with the gala," he said, trying to smooth things over. I smiled sweetly and replied, Oh, don't worry, Damien. I'm very good at multitasking. I can manage plenty of things at once. His smirk faltered. Small victory. The Whitlocks were used to power being loud arguments, declarations, announcements. They didn't understand the kind that worked quietly in the background, the kind that built slowly, invisibly, like water eroding stone. I didn't need to shout, I just needed to keep moving. A week after the gala, Margaret invited me for tea in her sunroom. The space was immaculate, white marble floors, golden accents, and the faint scent of jasmine tea. She seemed relaxed, almost human, as she poured my cup. Brielle, she began. I wanted to ask your opinion. You're practical. Unlike my children. I tilted my head, curious. Of course, what about? She sighed. I've been thinking about the future. I've given so much to this family, but I'm not sure they understand what it means to protect a legacy. Damien is impulsive. Callista, she's emotional. Nathan is kind, but not business-minded. Sometimes I wonder if anyone will carry the Whitlock name with integrity. I took a careful sip of tea before answering. I think legacy isn't just about blood, Margaret. It's about contribution. The people who truly value what you've built, those are the ones who should shape its future. Her eyes softened slightly. You really believe that? I do, I said. Loyalty should matter as much as lineage. Margaret smiled faintly. You have a way with words, Brielle. She didn't know those words were calculated, a seed I'd planted deliberately. The more she believed that merit mattered, the closer I came to dismantling her entire hierarchy from within. But every rise comes with resistance, and Callista was starting to sense she was losing ground. She began showing up unannounced again, usually when I was with Margaret. She'd bring her mother flowers, smile too wide, and steer the conversation back to herself. One afternoon, she even made a point to bring up my background. It's so inspiring that Brielle came from such humble beginnings, she said, her tone dripping with false sincerity. It must be such a learning curve, adjusting to how things are done here. Margaret didn't reply. But I caught the faintest hint of irritation on her face. I didn't take the bait either. It is a learning curve, I said pleasantly. But I've found that discipline and attention to detail translate anywhere, whether it's in business or family. Margaret nodded approvingly. Callista's smile faltered again. Later, when Callista left, Margaret sighed. She tries so hard to impress me, but it always feels hollow. I think she just wants your approval, I said gently. She's had it all her life, Margaret replied. Maybe that's the problem. That was when I knew I was inside her, trust not just emotionally but strategically. Still, I didn't underestimate Callista. I noticed her whispering more with Damien during family gatherings. They'd stop talking whenever I walked into the room. Once, I even caught her glancing at her phone and muttering, "We'll see what she's really hiding." When I mentioned it to April, the quiet cousin who'd always seemed out of place, she frowned. "Be careful," she warned softly. "Callista doesn't lose gracefully. She'll try to find something, anything to ruin you." I smiled. "Let her try." April hesitated. "You sound ready for her." I met her eyes. "I've spent most of my life proving myself to people who didn't think I deserved a place. I'm done proving. Now I'm planning." She looked at me with something between fear and admiration. What April didn't know was that I'd already begun to control the narrative. My social media presence was spotless. My records were clean. Every story about my past that could be used against me had already been rewritten, reshaped, redefined. I wasn't just one step ahead, I was 5. The Whitlocks thought they knew me. But the version they knew was the one I'd allowed them to see. Little did they know. The background Callista found was the one I'd carefully curated. Before I could win the game, I had to control the story they'd use against me. Callista's suspicions grew bolder after the gala. She'd never been subtle, but lately, her curiosity felt pointed, strategic. She'd drop passive comments in front of Margaret, little daggers wrapped in politeness. "I just think it's important to know who we're trusting with family affairs," she said one afternoon over brunch, her smile perfectly innocent. Margaret had simply frowned. Brielle has proven herself trustworthy, Callista. Not everyone needs to come from money to understand it. That comment should have satisfied her. Instead, I saw something shift behind Callista's eyes, a flash of embarrassment, then determination. She wasn't going to let it go. 2 weeks later, I received a message from an old college friend, Tessa, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. "Hey Bri, just giving you a heads up. Some woman called me asking about you, said she was doing a background check. I didn't tell her anything private, but it felt off. I didn't need to ask who it was." Callista had hired someone, probably a private investigator. I sat at my desk for a long time after that message, hands still on the keyboard. My reflection in the laptop screen looked calm, but my heart was pounding. I'd prepared for this possibility long before it happened, but preparation doesn't erase the sting of being hunted. When you come from nothing and make something of yourself, people like the Whitlocks don't see resilience, they see threat. They see a story they can twist. Fortunately, I'd made sure every version of my story was already twisted to my own design. Years ago, when I started my business, I'd hired a PR consultant to help polish my image. Back then, it was just about professionalism. But over time, I'd realized the power of narrative control. Every trace of my early struggles, my mother's illness, the debt we fought through, the part-time jobs I took to survive had been reframed. Not hidden, but reshaped. It all told the story of a woman who fought the odds and won. If Callista wanted dirt, all she'd find were flowers. Still, I needed to be careful. I called Tessa that evening. "Thank you for telling me," I said. She laughed softly. "Of course, I just said you were brilliant and a little scary in the best way. They didn't get anything from me." "Good," I replied, a hint of relief slipping through my voice. "If anyone else reaches out, please let me know." "I will," she said. Then after a pause, "Brielle, you're playing with powerful people, aren't you?" I hesitated. "No. I'm just learning to stand where I belong." Over the next week, I waited for the fallout. I expected whispers, accusations, maybe even an awkward confrontation. But instead, something else happened. Margaret called me to her study one morning. When I arrived, she was sitting behind her desk, a cup of tea untouched beside her. "Brielle," she said slowly, "I had an interesting conversation with Callista today." I braced myself. "She told me she was worried about your background," Margaret continued. "That she'd heard things. So, naturally, I asked what those things were." She looked up, eyes sharp. "Do you know what she said?" I shook my head. "She said she'd heard you came from a working-class family. That your mother had been sick. That you'd taken years to finish school because you were taking care of her." Margaret's tone softened. "Is that true?" I nodded carefully. "Yes. My mother was ill for a while. I worked through college to pay for her treatment. It wasn't easy, but it taught me endurance." Margaret's expression changed. The corners of her mouth lifted, not in mockery, but in something resembling respect. "Endurance," she repeated. "That's what most people lack." I exhaled silently. The trap had backfired on Callista. That evening, Nathan came home grinning. "You'll never guess what my mother said about you," he began. "She called you the strongest woman in the family. I think she finally sees what I've been trying to tell her." I smiled at him, but inside, something colder stirred. Margaret didn't see me. She saw a reflection of what she admired: discipline, composure, control, and I had given her exactly that. Over the next few days, I noticed the family dynamic shifting further. Margaret began involving me in more estate matters, small things at first, like managing invoices or reviewing donation paperwork. But then came something unexpected. One afternoon, as we sorted through old financial files, Margaret said, "I'm appointing you as a confidential contact for the attorney. You're detail-oriented, and I trust you more than anyone else in this family to make sure my affairs are properly documented." It took everything in me to keep my voice steady. "Of course, Margaret, I'm honored." "Don't make it sound so formal," she said with a smile. "You've earned it." That night, When I lay in bed beside Nathan, I couldn't sleep. His slow, peaceful breathing filled the dark room, but my thoughts were racing. I was now part of the paperwork, not just a bystander or a silent observer. My name, my influence was in the legal structure that defined the Whitlock legacy. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about position, authority. The kind of power that didn't need to be flaunted because it existed quietly, stamped and signed in black ink. For the first time, I understood that revenge didn't always look like destruction. Sometimes, it looked like quiet precision. Sometimes, it looked like control. For the first time, I wasn't just in their family. I was in their paperwork. It was just dinner, but the air was thick with hidden agendas. Margaret decided to host a private family dinner that evening. No guests, no photographers, no staff beyond the kitchen. That alone told me it wasn't going to be a casual affair. The Whitlocks never gathered without an audience unless something significant was brewing. Nathan mentioned it offhandedly that morning while I was making coffee. "Mom wants everyone at the estate tonight. She said it's important." "Did she say why?" I asked, already suspecting. He shrugged. "No. But she sounded serious." Of course she did. Margaret never wasted words. By the time we arrived, the atmosphere was as tense as the crisp linen folded around the dinner plates. The long mahogany table gleamed under chandelier light, and every member of the family sat in their familiar formation, as if posing for another photograph. Margaret was at the head, dignified and unreadable. Damien and his wife sat to her right, Callista to her left, Nathan and I across from them. April, quiet as always, had been placed near the end, like an afterthought. No one spoke at first. Only the faint sound of silver against porcelain filled the silence. Then Margaret cleared her throat. "I've made some decisions," she began, her tone calm but heavy. "About the future, about this family." Damien straightened. Callista's eyes flicked up, sharp and eager. Nathan looked confused. I, on the other hand, had been waiting for this. "I've been revising my estate plans," Margaret continued, cutting her steak with surgical precision. "And I believe it's time to reward loyalty and contribution, not just bloodlines." Callista laughed lightly, though it sounded forced. "Mother, you make it sound like we're employees getting performance reviews." "In a sense," Margaret replied without missing a beat. "You are." The table went silent again. I glanced at Nathan, whose brow furrowed in that familiar expression of mild discomfort. He hated family tension, but I lived for this kind of electricity, the crackle before the storm. Margaret turned to me. "Brielle, dear, you've been very helpful these past months. I wanted to thank you personally." I smiled modestly. "That's kind of you, Margaret. I'm happy to help." Callista's fork froze midair. "Helpful? How exactly?" Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "By being dependable. Something this family lacks," Damien muttered. "So now the in-law's the favorite." "Enough," Margaret said sharply. "This isn't about favoritism. It's about preparation." I could feel their resentment pressing against me from both sides of the table, but I didn't flinch. I'd been invisible once, now I was impossible to ignore. Dinner continued awkwardly after that. Polite conversation resumed, though everyone's smiles had become masks. But when dessert was served, Margaret surprised me again. "Brielle," she said. "Could you stay after? I'd like your opinion on something." "Of course," I replied. Nathan gave me a reassuring smile. He thought it was just a friendly chat. But I knew better. Margaret never asked for opinions she didn't already value. After everyone else had left, Margaret led me into her study. The smell of aged paper and polished wood filled the air. She gestured for me to sit. "Tell me something honestly," she said. "Do you think fairness in inheritance exists?" The question caught me off guard, though I kept my expression neutral. "Fairness?" I repeated. "I think it depends on what you're measuring. Fairness by love? By effort? By contribution?" She nodded slowly. "Exactly. You understand what my children don't. They believe inheritance is a birthright. But legacies are earned." I leaned forward slightly. "I think you're right. The people who uphold your legacy, protect it, and add to it. They're the ones who deserve to shape it. Margaret smiled faintly. You always know the right thing to say. I only speak what I believe, I said carefully. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she reached for a folder on her desk. I'm finalizing the revisions with Mr. Grayson next week. I want everything to reflect what's best for this family. Of course, I replied. That's wise. She looked at me over the rim of her glasses. You'll understand soon enough what that means. I nodded, keeping my tone neutral. Whatever you decide, I'm sure it will be fair. Fair, she repeated softly, almost as if testing the word. Yes, that's the goal. When I left her study that night, the rest of the family was already gone. The hallway lights had dimmed, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Nathan was waiting by the car, smiling like nothing had happened. How was it? He asked. She just wanted my opinion, I said simply. About what? Fairness. He chuckled. She's really taken to you, hasn't she? I smiled faintly, staring out the window as we drove away. Margaret's words replayed in my mind. You'll understand soon enough what that means. It wasn't just a comment, it was a promise or a warning. The next day, April texted me. Aunt Margaret seemed different last night, happier, like she'd made up her mind about something big. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. Maybe she finally knows who to trust. I didn't know exactly what Margaret was planning yet. But I knew one thing for certain. I'd positioned myself exactly where I needed to be. Callista and Damien could gossip all they wanted. Nathan could stay blissfully unaware. The pieces were already moving, and Margaret had just made me part of her endgame. But I could see the storm gathering. I had just lit the fuse. Callista's downfall started the moment she underestimated me. It didn't happen overnight. The Whitlocks never confronted each other directly. It wasn't their style. Their battles were fought with whispers, strategic smiles, and information passed like contraband. And this time, Callista was the one spreading poison through the family veins. After the dinner, I noticed small changes. Margaret's calls to me became more frequent, while her tone with Callista grew colder. Damien was restless, pacing like a dog who'd sensed something shifting in the house's balance. Nathan, ever oblivious, said only, "You and my mom are getting close. It's good for the family." Good for the family. He didn't realize it was tearing his apart. The first real crack came when I found out Callista had been talking to one of Margaret's old friends, feeding her selective stories about me. She'd painted me as manipulative, saying I'd been worming my way into Margaret's good graces for financial gain. That friend, unfortunately for her, was someone who adored gossip almost as much as she adored Margaret's favor. And Margaret told me about the rumor herself. Callista's been acting strangely, she said one afternoon, her voice cool and measured. Do you know anything about it? I feigned surprise. No. Why? She's been suggesting that you've been overly involved in matters that don't concern you. I set my teacup down gently. If that's true, then she must be worried about something. I've only ever done what you've asked me to. Margaret's expression softened slightly. Yes, I know. That was all I needed. Her trust solidified, even if she didn't realize it. But I didn't leave it at that. I decided to make sure Callista's whispers didn't just fall flat, they'd explode in her face. Over the next few weeks, I started documenting everything. Emails, texts, calendar invites, every piece of proof that showed I was following Margaret's explicit instructions. Then, I began sending a few carefully crafted messages to the right people. Subtle, harmless-seeming things like, Margaret asked me to confirm this for her, thank you. Or, per Mrs. Whitlock's approval. Those emails painted a very clear picture. I wasn't overstepping, I was executing Margaret's wishes. It didn't take long for those messages to circulate back through the family. Callista's attempts to make me look manipulative started backfiring. She looked paranoid, jealous. One afternoon, I caught her in the study, rifling through drawers. Looking for something? I asked from the doorway. She jumped, her cheeks flushing. Oh, I was just Mother asked me to check the donation records. Funny, I said, tilting my head. She asked me to file those yesterday. For a moment, the silence between us was taut and heavy. Then she smiled, brittle and forced. Of course she did. You're her new favorite toy. I don't think Margaret plays with toys, I said quietly. Her eyes narrowed. Don't act like you belong here, Brielle. You can dress the part, smile the part, but everyone knows where you came from. You'll never be one of us. I stepped closer, meeting her glare. Maybe not. But that doesn't matter if I'm the one she trusts. Her jaw clenched. For the first time, she didn't have a comeback. That night, I received a call from Margaret. Her tone was icy. I just spoke with Callista, she said. She accused you of tampering with my personal files. My heart beat once, hard, but I kept my voice calm. I'd never touch anything without your permission. I know, she replied. That's why I asked her to show proof. She couldn't, of course. And when I pressed her, she began crying about how she feels we're placed. I'm sorry, Margaret, I said softly. I never wanted to cause tension. You didn't, she said. She did. I think I've spoiled her for too long. When the call ended, I sat back in my chair, staring at the wall. Callista had just destroyed the fragile image of control she'd spent years cultivating. All I had to do was be calm while she unraveled. A few days later, Mr. Grayson called me into his office. Mrs. Whitlock asked me to revise the preliminary notes, he said. She'd like your input on a few structural points before we finalize anything. Me? I asked. Though I already knew the answer. He nodded. She trusts your judgment. I reviewed the draft carefully, pretending it was purely procedural. But each line I read confirmed what I'd suspected. Margaret was redistributing her assets. Damien and Callista's shares were being reduced. Nathan's was modestly increased. And April's sweet, forgotten April was receiving her late father's rightful inheritance. Margaret was rewriting her will, and she wanted me to help shape it. Callista must have sensed something, because the next family dinner was tense enough to cut with a knife. She was quiet, barely touching her food. Margaret ignored her completely. After dinner, Callista stormed out to the terrace, her heels clicking furiously against the stone. I followed her outside, the night air sharp with the scent of rain. Enjoying yourself? She snapped without turning around. I'm not the one losing sleep, I said evenly. She whirled to face me, eyes blazing. You think you've won, don't you? My mother might be blind now, but when she's gone, everyone will see you for what you are. I smiled faintly. Maybe. Or maybe they'll only remember who she trusted most. For a second, I thought she might slap me, but she didn't. She just stared at me, her breath coming fast, and then she turned on her heel and walked away. Inside, Margaret was speaking with Mr. Grayson again. When she saw me, she smiled. I've decided to finish everything next week, she said. I'd like you to sit in on the review. Of course, I said, my pulse steady despite the thunder rolling in the distance. As lightning flashed through the window, I couldn't help but glance back toward the terrace where Callista had disappeared into the shadows. That night, Margaret told me she was rewriting her will and that she wanted my advice. I watched Margaret's fountain pen move across the paper, sealing their fate with each stroke. The study smelled faintly of cedar and ink, that particular scent that always seemed to accompany the weight of permanence. The rain from the night before had left streaks across the tall windows, blurring the garden view into something gray and solemn. Margaret sat behind her desk, glasses perched on the edge of her nose, while Mr. Grayson read the final draft of her new will aloud in his calm, practiced voice. I stood beside her, silent but focused, as each clause was reviewed. Margaret had asked me there under the guise of proofreading for clarity, but we both knew it was more than that. Every detail mattered. Every word held meaning. Every line was a transaction of trust. This section, Mr. Grayson said, tapping the paper, clarifies the charitable endowment. You've expanded the annual scholarship fund in Andrew's name. Yes, I think he'd have liked that. April, Andrew's daughter, sat quietly in the corner, her hands folded in her lap. When her name came up in the document, She looked up with a startled expression. Miss April Whitlock is to receive the property on Riverside Lane, along with an annual distribution of interest from her father's original share, Mr. Grayson read. April blinked. I didn't know about that. Margaret smiled faintly. You've been overlooked long enough, dear. Your father would want you to have your share. I caught April's eyes for a moment. Gratitude flickered there, mingled with disbelief. Then came the part I'd been waiting for. As for the primary trust, Mr. Grayson continued, the new structure defines conditional inheritance distribution based on contribution, participation, and demonstrated responsibility in managing family assets. Callista shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Damien crossed his arms. Nathan, as usual, sat somewhere between pride and confusion. Margaret looked at me, her expression calm but decisive. Do you believe this sounds fair, Brielle? I met her gaze. It does. Loyalty and integrity should matter as much as lineage. Callista let out a scoff that quickly died under Margaret's glare. Good, Margaret said, signing the page. Then we'll proceed. The following 2 hours unfolded like a performance, Margaret the composer, Mr. Grayson the conductor, and me, quietly turning the pages of their symphony. Each paragraph reduced Damien and Callista's dominance a little more. Their financial shares shrank, their discretionary powers were restricted. Nathan's portion grew modestly, but his role wasn't financial, it was symbolic. He was the family's steady heart, as Margaret described it. But the most significant change wasn't the numbers, it was the structure. Margaret had created a co-executor position to oversee the trust alongside the family attorney. That position wasn't Nathan's, it wasn't Damien's, it wasn't Callista's, it was mine. I would have joint authority over every distribution, every decision, every revision to the estate's assets. On paper, it was administrative support. In reality, it was control. Mrs. Whitlock, Mr. Grayson said, sliding the document forward for her final review. Do you wish to designate a second witness for your co-executor clause? She smiled. No need, I've already spoken with everyone I trust. Her eyes flicked toward me. I felt a rush of adrenaline, though I kept my expression steady. I'll make sure everything remains organized, I said softly. I know you will, she replied. Callista couldn't hold back anymore. Mother, this is absurd. You're giving her what? Power over all of us? Over your estate? She's not even enough. Margaret's voice cracked like a whip. I've made my decision. Damien leaned forward. You're letting an outsider dictate how our family legacy is managed. Margaret's hand slammed the table, the sound echoing through the study. That outsider has done more for this family in 1 year than either of you have in 10. Silence followed, thick and heavy. Nathan looked at me, his expression torn between pride and guilt. He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing, just as he always did. When the signing was complete, Margaret pushed the documents toward Mr. Grayson. Make sure these are filed immediately, she instructed. He nodded. I'll deliver the final copies tomorrow. Margaret stood, her movements slow but deliberate. I feel lighter already, she said with a soft chuckle. As though I've finally done something truly right. Callista stormed out of the room. Damien followed, muttering something under his breath. April quietly hugged Margaret and whispered, "Thank you." When the others were gone, Margaret turned to me. You know, Brielle, I wasn't sure about you at first. I know, I said with a faint smile. But you've proven yourself, she continued. Not because you tried to please me, but because you understand what this family really is. You've seen its flaws and still helped me hold it together. I only wanted to help you protect what you've built, I replied. She looked pleased by that. And you have. More than you realize. That evening, as Nathan and I drove home, he reached across the console to squeeze my hand. I'm proud of you, he said quietly. You've become the one person everyone can rely on. I turned my head toward the window, watching the lights from passing cars blur against the glass. He meant it as a compliment, but I couldn't help the thought that flickered through my mind. Reliance is another word for power. By the next morning, the documents had been notarized. Mr. Grayson sent confirmation that everything was finalized. The Whitlock estate had officially been restructured, and the hierarchy was forever changed. I was no longer the woman in the back row. I was the signature behind every decision that mattered. I didn't need to be in the front row anymore. Their entire legacy now stood behind me. Everything shifted the day Margaret's health began to decline. It started subtly, a forgotten appointment here, a missed word there. For a woman who had always ruled her world with precision, even the smallest lapse was noticeable. At first, she brushed it off, insisting she was just tired. But fatigue became frailty, and frailty turned into something we could no longer ignore. Nathan got the call first. "Your mother fainted at the club." The voice on the other end told him. By the time we reached the hospital, Margaret was already awake, surrounded by worried staff and the cold glow of monitors. "I told them I just stood up too fast," she said irritably when we arrived. But her complexion was pale, her movements slow. The doctor's tone was careful but clear. "Mrs. Whitlock needs rest. Her blood pressure is unstable, and stress will only make it worse." Stress. The one thing Margaret had built her entire identity around controlling. From that day on, the power in the Whitlock household began to shift, not with noise, but with quiet inevitability. Margaret was still sharp, but she no longer had the stamina to oversee everything. And that's when the others began circling like vultures. Callista was the first to show up uninvited, armed with flowers and guilt. "Mother, I'm so sorry I haven't been around more," she said sweetly, perching on the edge of the hospital bed. "I just can't stand seeing you like this." Margaret's response was icy. "Then don't look." Callista's smile faltered. Damien followed next, trying a softer approach, bringing paperwork for her to review, as if business would somehow make her feel better. Margaret waved him off. "I'm not dying, Damien, not yet." But her hands trembled as she said it. Nathan was different. He didn't argue, didn't scheme, he just sat quietly by her side, reading aloud from her favorite old novels. She seemed to like that. She'd often doze off mid-chapter, her hand still resting over his. And me? I became the constant. Every morning I brought fresh flowers and updates on her estate affairs. Every afternoon I handled calls from Mr. Grayson or the accountants. The hospital staff knew me by name. I was the one who coordinated her medications, arranged her transportation. It wasn't obligation, it was strategy wrapped in devotion. The more she relied on me, the more the others noticed. One afternoon, while I was refilling Margaret's tea, Callista cornered me in the hallway. "Playing nurse now, are we?" she said, her tone sugary but venomous. "I suppose this is convenient for you." I looked at her calmly. "I'm just helping your mother get better." She stepped closer, her perfume thick and suffocating. "You really think you've won, don't you?" "I'm not competing," I said quietly. "Of course not," she hissed. "That's what makes it worse." Before I could respond, the sound of a cough interrupted us. Margaret was standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Callista, I think you've done enough for today." Callista froze, then muttered something under her breath before storming past me. Margaret's gaze softened as she turned to me. "Don't waste your energy on her. You can't reason with insecurity." "I know," I said. "But I still feel bad for her." "Don't," Margaret replied. "Some people mistake entitlement for love. You're not one of them." That moment stayed with me. Not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. For the first time, she sounded tired, human. Over the following weeks, her health continued to decline. The house grew quieter, her children more desperate. Damien began calling more often, insisting on updates. Callista made performative visits, taking pictures of herself beside Margaret's bedside under the guise of preserving memories. But the person Margaret trusted was still me. One rainy afternoon, she asked me to sit beside her in the study. "Brielle," she said softly, "I've been thinking about the final draft of my documents." I nodded. "Everything is in order," Mr. Grayson confirmed last week. "I know," she said. But I want to make sure nothing changes when I'm gone. No confusion. No disputes. There won't be, I assured her. It's airtight. She smiled faintly. Good. I've seen too many families tear each other apart over greed. I won't let that happen here. That night, Damien called the house. His voice was low, cautious. Brielle, I want to ask you something off the record. What is it? Mother's been different lately. Saying strange things. Are you sure she's fit to make these decisions? I paused. She's as sharp as ever. You might not like her choices, but they're hers. He sighed. You're very protective of her, aren't you? I just respect her, I said. Something you might try sometime. He hung up. The next morning, Margaret confided that Damien had accused her of being manipulated. He came by the office, she said, her tone clipped. Told Mr. Grayson he was concerned about my state of mind. My stomach twisted, though my expression didn't change. What did you tell him? I told him, she said, that I document every important conversation I have, and I keep records of every meeting. That shut him up. Her lips curled into a smile. He forgets who taught him to be cunning. I smiled back, admiring her resilience. But I also knew what she hadn't realized yet. I had already been keeping my own records too. Every word, every decision, every accusation. Not for her, for me. Because in families like the Whitlocks, power didn't just transfer when someone died. It shifted when the evidence demanded it. And I was making sure the evidence told my version of the story. He had no idea I'd already documented every conversation he'd weaponized. The day of the will's signing was both quiet and seismic. Margaret insisted it be done at home, not at the law office. If this document is going to define the rest of their lives, she said, then I want to sign it under my own roof. That sentiment sounded noble, but I could see the unspoken message beneath it. This was her kingdom, and even in frailty, she would rule until her last breath. The morning was cold and still. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh ink. Mr. Grayson arrived precisely at 10, his briefcase clicking open with the kind of precision that seemed to punctuate every important moment in the Whitlock family. 2 witnesses followed, a notary and an old family friend who'd served as legal backup for decades. Margaret was dressed impeccably, despite her weakness, a navy dress, pearl earrings, her silver hair brushed into place. She looked every bit the matriarch she had always been. When she saw me, she smiled faintly. Brielle, would you mind sitting beside me? I'd like you close. Of course, I said, taking my seat next to her at the long oak table. Nathan stood behind us, hands in his pockets. Callista and Damien sat across the room, whispering furiously to each other. Their expressions were tight, desperate, like people watching their inheritance slip through their fingers in real time. Mr. Grayson began to read through the final clauses, his voice calm and steady. This document supersedes all previous versions of the Whitlock family trust. The estate, holdings, and intellectual property described herein shall be managed according to the instructions outlined below. I watched every flicker of Margaret's expression as her legacy was spoken into permanence. Each section carried weight, each word shifting the balance of a lifetime of control. When it came time to sign, Margaret looked up. Everyone here understands this document reflects my will and my will alone? Callista's jaw clenched. Mother, are you sure you've— Yes, Margaret said sharply. I've reviewed every line, Damien tried again. Maybe you should— Damien, she interrupted, her tone steely. You've had decades to earn my confidence. You failed. Don't embarrass yourself further. The silence that followed was deafening. Nathan shifted uncomfortably, his loyalty pulled in too many directions. I didn't look at him. My eyes stayed on Margaret. She took the pen from Mr. Grayson, her hand trembling slightly as she placed the tip on the paper. For a moment, she hesitated, then signed with a slow, deliberate flourish. There, she said softly. Done. Mr. Grayson nodded, collecting each signature, ensuring every witness signed appropriately. This will is now legally binding, he said. A testament to Mrs. Whitlock's final wishes. Margaret leaned back, a satisfied smile playing at her lips. Thank you, everyone. You've all witnessed history, though some of you may not appreciate it yet. Callista stood abruptly. You can't just... Yes, I can, Margaret said, her voice calm but final. And I just did, Damien's fists clenched. You've given control of this family to an outsider. Margaret glanced at me. No, I've given it to someone who earned it. For a moment, no one spoke. Even Nathan seemed too stunned to process what had just happened. Mr. Grayson cleared his throat. Mrs. Whitlock, would you like me to record an acknowledgement for your files? Please, she said. He set up a small audio recorder and asked her to confirm her intent for the record. Her voice was clear, unwavering. I, Margaret Whitlock, declare that the document signed today represents my final will and testament, witnessed by all present. These decisions were made of my own volition and reviewed in full. When he stopped the recording, she turned to me. Brielle, you'll ensure copies go to the proper parties, yes? Yes, of course, I said quietly. Nathan finally found his voice. Mom, are you sure this is balanced? I mean, Callista and Damien, I've given them what they deserve. She interrupted. No more, no less. Mr. Grayson closed his briefcase. Congratulations, Mrs. Whitlock. Everything is official. The witnesses left soon after, murmuring polite goodbyes. Callista stormed out without a word. Damien lingered just long enough to glare at me before slamming the door behind him. When the room was finally quiet, Margaret looked at me again. Her voice softened. You know, Brielle, I never thought someone like you would be the one to steady this family. I'm honored, I said, meaning every word. She gave a tired smile. Maybe there's still hope for us yet. That night I sat in my home office, a copy of the signed will in front of me. The signature, her bold, looping scrawl, gleamed in black ink. Next to it was mine, small but permanent. Nathan walked in quietly. You look serious, he said. It's just surreal, I replied, seeing it all finalized. He smiled faintly. You've done something incredible, Brielle. You've made her proud. I looked down at the papers. Proud wasn't the word I'd use. The word was inevitable. Because now, on paper, I wasn't just a member of their family. I was its guardian, its keeper, its gate. I walked out of that room not just a daughter-in-law, but the architect of their fate. When Margaret passed away 2 months later, chaos erupted. It happened quietly, without spectacle. One morning, the nurse found her still in bed, her breathing shallow but calm, her hands resting on a folded blanket as if she'd simply drifted into a deeper sleep. The housekeeper called Nathan, who called me, his voice trembling. Brielle, he said. Mom's gone. The world seemed to stop for a moment. Even though I'd been expecting it, the finality hit like a slow-moving storm, a silence that carried weight. When we arrived at the estate, the air was heavy with mourning, though not all of it was genuine. Callista was the first to arrive, dressed in black silk, her face a perfect composition of grief for the cameras. Damien followed, stiff and red-eyed, pacing the marble floors like a restless shadow. April cried quietly in a corner, while Nathan stood beside me, his hand tight around mine. Margaret's body was taken away by professionals who spoke in gentle tones. As they zipped up the white shroud, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and completion. She had been my adversary, my teacher, and, in some twisted way, my greatest ally. The funeral was grand, of course, just as Margaret would have wanted. Ornate flowers, an endless stream of guests, a eulogy that painted her as the flawless matriarch she had spent her life pretending to be. But beneath the surface, her family was already cracking apart. After the service, as mourners began to leave, Callista cornered Mr. Grayson. When will the will be read? She demanded, her voice brittle. He blinked. There are procedures, Mrs. Cartwright. We'll convene the reading within the week. Her lips tightened. Good. Let's get it over with. I said nothing. though she glared at me as if I'd written her sentence personally. The day of the reading arrived like a storm. The Whitlock study was dim, the curtains drawn, the air thick with perfume and tension. Mr. Grayson sat at Margaret's desk, her final document neatly placed before him. Nathan sat beside me, Callista and Damien across from us. April sat quietly in the back, her hands folded. Mr. Grayson cleared his throat. As you all know, Mrs. Whitlock executed her final will and testament in this very room. I will now read her declarations in full. He began to speak, and with every word, the family's faces shifted. To my son Nathan, I leave a portion of the family trust equal to his commitment to integrity and compassion. To my granddaughter April, I restore her late father's rightful share of the estate, ensuring her independence and education. To my children, Damien and Callista, I leave the remainder of assets as specified, subject to conditions of accountability and review by the co-executor. He paused. The co-executor, as appointed, is Mrs. Brielle Whitlock. The room fell silent. Callista's eyes widened, her voice breaking the quiet. What? Mr. Grayson continued evenly. Mrs. Brielle Whitlock will serve alongside myself as co-executor of the Whitlock estate, with full authority to manage, approve, and enforce the provisions within this document. Damien stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is insane. She manipulated her way into this. Mr. Grayson didn't flinch. Everything was witnessed, verified, and recorded. Mr. Whitlock, your mother was of sound mind and her decision stands. Callista's voice rose. Of course you'd say that you've been under her spell from the start. Nathan tried to intervene. Callista, please, don't you dare defend her, she spat, pointing at me. She played all of us. Look at her, she's sitting there like she expected this. I met her gaze, calm and unblinking. I didn't expect anything, I said softly. I just respected your mother's wishes. April spoke then, her quiet voice cutting through the noise. She's telling the truth. Aunt Margaret told me weeks ago that she trusted Brielle more than anyone. She said Brielle reminded her of herself when she was young. Callista turned toward April, disbelief etched across her face. You're siding with her too? I'm siding with what's right, April said. You and Damien never saw her for what she was: strong, loyal, and patient. Aunt Margaret saw it. Mr. Grayson resumed reading, ignoring the chaos. All conditions have been notarized and are effective immediately. The charitable endowments, real estate transfers, and trust accounts will be handled under co-executive authority. When he finished, silence settled over the room. You could almost hear the sound of years of entitlement crumbling. Callista sank back into her chair, pale and shaking. Damien paced, muttering about lawyers and appeals. Nathan just stared at me, eyes wide, as if seeing me clearly for the first time. When the meeting ended, Callista brushed past me roughly. You'll regret this, she whispered. You think you've won, but you don't know what family can do when it's cornered. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Outside, the sky was gray and heavy with rain, again the same kind of day Margaret had signed her will. Nathan walked beside me, silent for most of the drive home. Finally, he said. I didn't realize how much she trusted you. She didn't trust easily, I said quietly. He looked at me, his voice barely above a whisper. Did you know all along this would happen? I turned to him, meeting his eyes. I knew she'd see the truth eventually. When we reached home, I poured a glass of wine and stood by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. Behind me, the silence of the house felt different, less fragile, more permanent. The Whitlocks had spent their lives trying to push me to the back, to blur me out of their perfect picture. But now, their fortune, their future, and their family name were all filtered through me. They had built their empire on legacy. I had quietly built mine on their arrogance. They had put me in the back row, but now, they were all standing behind me. Power doesn't shout, it sits quietly and lets others reveal their greed. In the weeks following the will's reading, the Whitlock estate felt like a chessboard after a game ended, pieces scattered, loyalties broken, and everyone trying to remember the rules. Margaret was gone, but her decisions lived on in the signatures she left behind, echoing through every conversation, every whispered accusation. Nathan's siblings reacted exactly as expected. Damien buried himself in meetings with lawyers, insisting there had to be a loophole. "Mother wasn't thinking clearly," he said in every phone call. "We can contest this. We will contest this." Callista, on the other hand, weaponized social appearances. She hosted luncheons where she played the role of the grieving daughter, spinning stories about manipulation and betrayal. Her performance was flawless tears at just the right moments, soft tremors in her voice. But the people she invited were smart enough to recognize bitterness when they heard it. Meanwhile, I stayed silent. I didn't need to defend myself. The documents spoke louder than I ever could. Nathan was caught in the middle, as always. "They're hurting," he told me one night. "You have to understand, they're not used to losing." I looked at him over my glass of wine. "Then maybe it's time they learned how." He exhaled. "You sound like her." "Maybe she rubbed off on me," I said. I wasn't wrong. Margaret had taught me more than any mentor ever could about patience, leverage, and the subtle art of appearing harmless until it was too late to stop you. My days became structured around estate work. Meetings with Mr. Grayson, conference calls with trustees, managing property transfers and charity allocations. The world now addressed me as Mrs. Whitlock, co-executor, and people who once dismissed me now waited for my approval. At first, the power felt heavy, unfamiliar. But over time, it became natural, like slipping into a well-tailored coat. April was the only one who seemed genuinely happy about the outcome. She'd visit the house often, helping with paperwork and small tasks, always polite, always grateful. "Aunt Margaret would have been proud of how you handled everything," she said one afternoon. "Maybe," I replied. "Or maybe she would have found something to correct." April laughed softly. "Probably both." I liked April. She had Margaret's quiet intelligence but none of her arrogance. So when I set up a scholarship fund in her father's name, I did it partly for strategy but mostly because it felt right. Not everything I did was out of vengeance. Some of it was balance. A month later, Damien filed a legal challenge, claiming undue influence and mental incapacity. Mr. Grayson called me into his office with a thin smile. "They'll lose," he said simply. "The recordings, the witnesses, the notarized confirmations, it's airtight." Still, I attended the court proceedings, not because I was required, but because I wanted to see their faces when the judge dismissed the case. Damien looked furious. Callista looked shattered. Nathan looked tired. When it was over, the attorney approached me privately. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, "I've dealt with many families, but I have to say, the way you've navigated this calmly, methodically, it's remarkable." "Thank you." "But I only did what Margaret asked," he smiled knowingly. "Perhaps. But you did it better." That evening, I found Nathan sitting in Margaret's old library, staring at the portrait of his mother that hung above the fireplace. "She'd be proud," he said quietly. "Would she?" I asked. He nodded. "She always said the family needed someone who could handle pressure. You did that, even when everyone turned on you." I looked at him carefully. "Do you really believe that?" He hesitated. "I want to." His uncertainty didn't surprise me. Nathan had always lived in the soft space between belief and doubt. He loved me. I knew that, but he also loved peace. And peace rarely survives power. Over the next few weeks, I focused on finalizing the estate's charitable ventures. Every news article about the Whitlock Foundation now mentioned my name. Every donation bore my signature. Callista and Damien's names faded from relevance, replaced by a narrative Margaret herself had started. Brielle Whitlock, the woman who restored order to a fractured legacy. One morning, April stopped by unexpectedly, holding a folder. "I found something in one of Aunt Margaret's old boxes," she said. "It's addressed to Nathan." The envelope was yellowed and sealed with her distinctive handwriting. Nathan opened it later that night while I sat beside him. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper. The letter was short, written in Margaret's neat cursive. "My dear Nathan, if you're reading this, then I've left the world as I intended on my terms. You will have questions, and that's good. But I want you to understand that power isn't inherited, it's earned. I gave Brielle the position she holds not because of manipulation, but because she sees what others refuse to. Protect her, Nathan. She's the only one who understands what this family truly needed. Nathan read it twice, then folded it carefully. She trusted you more than any of us. I earned it, I said quietly. He looked at me for a long time, his eyes searching. Did you plan all this? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I traced the rim of my glass and said, I planned to survive. He nodded slowly. And now? Now I plan to thrive. April's scholarship fund launched the following month, drawing praise in the local press. My inbox filled with messages from investors and community leaders wanting to collaborate. Invitations arrived for galas and conferences. The same circles that once ignored me now clamored for my attention. Callista and Damien faded into silence, their influence gone. Nathan, caught between admiration and unease, stayed by my side, though I could sense the questions building behind his quiet glances. But I didn't fear him finding the truth, because deep down, he already knew. But even I didn't expect what Nathan would find hidden in Margaret's final letter. Nathan handed me the letter with trembling hands, his voice barely steady. We were sitting in Margaret's old study, the same place where everything had started. The will, the meetings, the manipulations, the lessons. The air felt heavier that evening, thick with memory and something unspoken. I found this tucked behind one of her journals, Nathan said quietly, sliding the letter across the desk toward me. It's addressed to you. My breath caught. The envelope was sealed in her familiar wax stamp, an ornate W pressed into the scarlet seal. I stared at it for a moment, my chest tightening. Even now, months after her passing, she was still finding ways to surprise me. Are you going to open it? He asked. I nodded, breaking the seal carefully. The paper inside was crisp. The handwriting elegant but firm, just like her voice. My dear Brielle. By now, I imagine the house feels quieter without me. Good. It's about time silence took up space in this family instead of ego. I know what you think, that I didn't see what you were doing. But I did. I saw everything. Every calculated gesture, every patient silence, every decision meant to earn my trust. You remind me of myself when I was your age, except you had to work harder for what came to me by birth. That's why I chose you. You were the only one willing to play the long game. The only one who didn't crumble when ignored. You understood that power isn't taken in grand gestures, it's gathered quietly, one overlooked opportunity at a time. Don't let guilt weaken you. You did what was necessary. You became what this family needed, even if they'll never thank you for it. But remember this, power and peace rarely live in the same house. If you choose one, the other will leave. And someday, you'll have to decide which you value more. Margaret Whitlock. I read the letter twice before looking up. Nathan was watching me, waiting for an explanation. What does it say? He asked softly. I folded it carefully. She knew, I said. Knew what? Everything. Nathan frowned. Everything what, Brielle? That I wasn't there to blend in, I said. That I came prepared to fight for my place. And she respected it. He looked away, struggling to process the weight of it. So she knew you were manipulating her? I smiled faintly. I never lied to her, Nathan. I just understood her language. He stood up, pacing slowly near the fireplace. She loved you in her own twisted way, didn't she? Yes, I said quietly, and I think she wanted me to finish what she started. He turned to face me, his expression torn between admiration and fear. You sound like her. Maybe that's why she chose me. Nathan ran a hand through his hair, then sighed. I don't know whether to be grateful or terrified. I walked toward him, placing my hand on his chest. Be both. That's what strength feels like. He didn't reply. He just stared at me for a long time, and I knew part of him was realizing that the woman he'd married, the one he thought was kind and patient, had evolved into something else entirely. Later that night, after he went to bed, I sat alone in the study with Margaret's letter on the desk before me. The lamplight flickered across the words, casting long shadows across the page. Power and peace rarely live in the same house. I traced the sentence with my fingertip, realizing that Margaret had left me more than an inheritance. She left me a mirror. She hadn't been blind to my ambition, she'd been measuring it. And when she saw that I could play her game and win, she'd rewarded me not with wealth, but with her legacy. That was the real inheritance. I glanced at the shelf where her old journals were neatly stacked. They were filled with decades of decisions, observations, and family secrets, blueprints of control. I ran my fingers along the spines before pulling one out. The first page contained a single note in her handwriting. Every empire begins with a woman who refuses to be invisible. I smiled. The next morning, April visited to finalize the Foundation's first official scholarship ceremony. She looked around the office, still reverent whenever she stood in the same room Margaret once ruled. "You've done something incredible," she said. "The charity's already changing lives." Aunt Margaret would have been proud. "Maybe," I said, glancing at the letter on the desk. But pride wasn't really her goal. Legacy was. April smiled gently. Then I think she got both. After she left, I walked through the house slowly, touching the walls, the framed portraits, the perfectly preserved memories. In the main hallway hung the infamous family photo, the one from that awful day when I'd been pushed into the back row. For years I'd hated that photo. The blurred corner of my smile, the shadowed space where I stood half hidden. But now, looking at it again, I felt something different. Satisfaction. Every person in that picture had been trying to keep me small. Now every single one of them answered to my name through contracts, signatures, and clauses that could never be undone. I didn't move the photograph. I didn't need to. I'd outgrown the space it represented. I poured myself a cup of tea, sat at Margaret's desk, and signed a new document, one that would ensure the Foundation's expansion and preserve her legacy, and mine, for decades to come. I paused, before writing my name, glancing once more at the old photo hanging behind me. Because in the end, being in the back didn't make me invisible, it made me unforgettable.